computer or via the conference line, all attendees will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. Those participating through their computer have the ability to send questions to us through the questions pane on your attendee interface. Simply type in your question and click send. At the end of the presentation, we will answer as many questions as we have time for. If your question is not addressed during Q&A, we will be sure to follow up with you afterward. Please also note the material related to the issues we'll be covering today, including the presentation, is accessible within the handouts area of the attendee interface. As a final note, today's webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive an email within 24 hours with a link to view the recording. Any of your colleagues who registered for the webinar but were not able to attend will also receive the link to the recording, and the recording will be posted in the events section of kaufmanhall.com as an on-demand webinar. With regard to today's agenda, we'll be first covering defining financial health in today's environment, then discussing moving from financial health to risk management, and of course, again, we will leave time at the end of the presentation to respond to your questions and concerns. With that, I will turn it over to Charles Kim.
Good afternoon. I'd like to start off the webinar discussing and setting the framework for defining financial health. I'll do that with an introduction and start talking about some of the potential financial dislocations or challenges that the higher industry sector is currently facing. And whether you're a large or small or public or private, you may be feeling some of these pressures that are in the graphic, whether that's revenue expense pressures, caused by limited ability to raise tuition or decline in the high school graduates in your region, capital funding needs that are still out there, such as deferred maintenance. I think we would all agree on the challenging environment that universities and colleges across the nation are currently under. So given that, we think there are three main imperatives for financial health. One is to actually define and test financial health, and we'll talk about how we define financial health as a firm. Next, we'll talk about understand the sources and characteristics of potential stressors to financial health. Eric will cover that as he talks about risk. And then really as a further outgrowth of the risk, we think quantifying and inventorying risk is a really important decision support framework that promotes balancing financial health and managing risk. So with that, let's go to the slide on realizing financial health. So I'm going to go straight into defining financial health from our perspective. We think financial health is realized when the institution performs at a level where operating needs are met and sufficient capital is generated from internal external sources to fund investments needed to support its mission and remain competitive. I think historically, many universities and colleges have thought of these items in sort of separate silos, whether that's looking at our endowment or however we define wealth and cash. We've looked at that in a silo and said, well, as long as that pocket or bucket of funding is available, that may define financial health in terms of overall wealth. I think we've historically looked at debt capacity as being available over a given period of time, and I think that was certainly true in times of stability. But given some of the challenges that we talked about, debt capacity may not always be available, and managing debt capacity within a certain credit context we think is going to be very, very important. So beyond and then philanthropy as well, some of you may have large capital campaigns underway or have finished one. Some of the institutions on this phone may not rely on philanthropy as a major funding engine. So, but beyond sort of the financial capacity that you see on the x-axis there, we think it's also important to marry that up with the quantification of strategy and related investments, because you may have debt capacity, you may have other cash and funding sources and philanthropy as well, but if that's far outstripped by the investments and the capital that you need to invest in, we don't think necessarily that may be a sign of financial health. So I think many institutions that we work with and our healthcare clients as well are typically operating in that area of short-term concern where our strategy and related investments outstrip our financial capacity. So finding a way or a roadmap to getting into that balancing line of corridor control and sustaining that level of performance, we think, is really the definition of financial health. So how do we define, or how do we get to that picture of financial health and really have a roadmap that gets us into that balancing point where we have the uses of our capital and the sources of our capital match? We think a multi-year strategic and financial capital plan really sets the basis, sets the context and the roadmap that gives an institution the roadmap to achieving that. We think there are really 4 major steps there. One is understanding the current credit position within capital markets expectations. As I said before, within times of stability, we certainly think that capacity was there, and you may use up that capacity, but soon thereafter, give it 2-3 years, that capacity comes back, and there was really no question. But we think actively managing to credit, actively managing to some of the ratios that you might be adhered to as an institution is really, really important, because there aren't many institutions around the country that can support all of the investments that it needs to make purely from operating cash flows or purely from philanthropy. That is certainly an important piece of that. Number 2, we think institutions need to quantify the current capital position relative to strategic requirements. So this also goes back to the framework that we just talked about. So it's not only identifying what resources do we have, but also inventorying and quantifying what some of the requirements are in order to fulfill our mission, in order to execute on our strategic plan. And then finally, once that context is set in terms of credit as well as the capital position, we think developing a realistic financial plan that supports the execution is really, really important. And that's the roadmap, to say, okay, here is our financial position today, here are our resources, here's what we need to invest into the future, here's the credit context that we want to maintain, here's the debt capacity that we might be able to we have today, and then to have an operating financial roadmap that marries your strategy and all of the investments, plus how the institution needs to perform in the future in order to achieve financial health. And then once that plan is developed, then it's really a matter of communication and directing the plan's implementation. We'll talk about that in detail in some of the upcoming slides. So step 1 is understanding the comprehensive credit position of the institution. And I mentioned ratios before, and that's certainly one piece of it, and certainly very, very important. So within your credit rating, there are medians that are published that you can compare yourselves against to. There are also peers that the capital markets might compare your institution against, and it'd be really important to assess yourself from, at least from a quantitative perspective, against those peers as well. But at the same time, we don't believe that necessarily credit ratings are a function of purely the numbers or the ratios. There are other qualitative factors that go into it, such as your market strength, such as in terms of student demand. Donor support is certainly important. Historical operating performance is important. Governance, management, your mission and your strategy, and how you sort of execute on that, and being nimble, that's certainly important. Legal structure of your covenants are important, and then also your financial resources and liquidity. So all those things are really important, and in order to set the credit context and as a starting point to define financial health, we think understanding an institution's credit position is really important. Number 2, as I talked about, we need to understand the institution's capital position. By capital position, I am talking about some of the circles that you see on this page here. The typical place that we like to start is really identifying and quantifying how much capital do we need to spend over the next 5, 7, 10 years in order to support our mission. So that's really starting with the strategic plan, and the strategic plan must define at a certain level the required investments. And then once we have that, we go into how much debt. So how much debt do we have today within our rating category? What is our debt capacity, or our ability to go out and issue additional debt? And if we do so, can we support that from the cash flows that the institution is currently generating? Finally, third, how much cash is also important. I think Eric will go into this a little bit more in detail, but I think in times of stability, we really separated the endowment or the quasi-endowment, some of the long-term invested assets from short-term cash. But we certainly think the cash question in the times of instability is certainly a very relevant and important question, and Moody's recently published several new ratios that they're going to be using going forward in order to really drill down on this cash and liquidity question. Are there other sources and uses? So do we have a capital campaign? Can we monetize certain real estate? Are there certain partnerships that we can do? That's certainly a source or potential use. And then finally, operations. How much cash flow do we need to generate as an institution so that we can form capital over a given period of time beyond what we have available from external sources? Finally, step number 3 is developing the realistic plan. And you see the graphic on the left there. It's an iterative process where you're marrying strategies, your capital, your baseline operations into a financial plan, running sensitivities and risk analysis, and through several iterations, really coming up with an achievable plan. But that plan sets out potentially a roadmap for what other financing transaction might need to occur, what portfolio of strategic initiatives that you might pursue, what investment decisions you're going to make, and then also, and this really ties into your annual operating budget, what are some of the targets that's required in terms of revenues and expenses? We really believe that using a highly sophisticated technology platform to be able to forecast this is very, very important, starting with a base case, which is really your sort of same store or current operations, layering in incrementally the required investments, but then also the operating impact of your portfolio of strategic initiatives, and then consolidating into all of that into a set of variety of scenarios which depict the future state and whether you're going to be able to achieve financial health or not. So this really sets the baseline for that. And then once that's developed on page 11, you need to communicate that and direct the plan's implementation. So you see a annual roadmap that we put that we believe is best practices. And the real takeaway here is that we believe that once you develop that long-range financial plan, that year 1 must be the institution's budget. And those updates to the plan must occur annually and potentially even more frequently as things change rapidly in this environment. So as you see in the graphic there, we believe that it starts with the strategic plan, which feeds the long-range financial plan, which allows the institution to develop short-term performance targets. And those targets become the foundation or the basis for developing the annual budget. And then as you see all of the other elements there, they all tie in, and there's this interrelationship between all of those. And we believe that interrelationship between strategic planning, financial planning, budgeting, as well as capital allocation, all those sort of separate finance functions integrated together is really best practices that we would recommend. So with that, we talked about financial health and defining and a roadmap to setting the definition for financial health. I'll turn it over to Eric to talk about risk management.
Great. Thanks, Charles. So, the corridor of control is really a hallmark of our firm. We like this concept because it's pretty clear and you can apply it to a wide range of corporate activities. So Charles described its place in a baseline financial plan, where what it's really about is, finding that balance point between sources and uses of capital. And that set of work that Charles described is really all about identifying and then testing for performance against a series of financial ratio targets. You can take the same corridor of control concept and apply it to risk. But here it shifts towards thinking about and exploring and looking for that balance point between how much risk the organization can carry versus its risk-bearing resources. So that, is almost a set of work that's interested in exploring and testing balance points between the pursuit of return versus the management of risk. So how are resources deployed in that equation? And sometimes you have to make a choice in the balancing of those two, those two objectives. And this work, different than thinking about financial targets, is really about trying to identify and test that same baseline financial performance against a series of floors. So more the notion about how low can you go against targets versus your ability to meet the particular targets. So Kaufman Hall is a firm that focuses primarily on operations, capital, and liabilities. The work that we do around invested assets is pretty much singularly focused on risk and the topic we're talking about here today. We do, however, wind up seeing a lot of different risk analytics from a lot of different firms, including both investment banks and investment advisors. And what we've learned over the years is that most risk analysis and decision making is fairly fragmented across, operations and capital, then liabilities, and then invested assets. And a lot of this work can be really substantive, done by really smart, capable people. But the typical approach tends to be managing risk or optimizing that risk-return equation in a defined silo. And the silo usually tracks to that particular firm's area of interest or expertise. Sometimes there's a nod to other areas, sort of like in an asset liability management equation. But even here, the orientation is mostly around sort of a business or a credit or an activity vertical. And that's the analytical orientation, is vertical. In times of business model stability, this approach is fine. It can produce very, very good results. I mean, you can think about, you can optimize an investment portfolio as purely an investment equation with only sort of a passing connection to operations and be fine in an environment where the operating model is pretty stable and you know what's going to happen there. But in times of volatility and transformation, we think that this fragmentation itself becomes a risk factor, and that what becomes important is how to assess things if you took a different view. And if you shifted the decision support framework towards something that tests and looks across the verticals and takes on more of a horizontal perspective. Ultimately, it actually all comes back to that sort of corridor control framework. But the question is, what's the corridor used to test control? Again, typically that corridor gets tested as a vertical, so something like invested assets, and you go deep into there. But what we're interested in is changing that notion of a corridor, looking across the business and shifting the orientation of the analysis from vertical to horizontal. And that's really the heart of our work. This new Era Treasury concept that's sort of identified on slide 15 is just a schematic that sort of highlights the shift that we're interested in exploring. Most of the time, the Treasury segment within an organization is going to be looking at the top part of this chart. Sort of a Treasury operations and then funding and credit, financing and investing activity. It's very much of a balance sheet focus and orientation. And again, lots of great work gets done there. But what we're interested in doing is seeing the Treasury model shift and start to pull in more of an enterprise focus that starts to take into consideration operations and strategic initiatives as part of that planning process. So what the work Charles described in thinking about organizational financial health, we would refer to as integrated strategic and financial planning. And that's how we've thought about that work forever. But the next imperative, or what we're talking about here, is really moving from that construct to inserting Treasury into that construct, so getting to something that we would call an integrated strategic Treasury and financial plan. And that picks up this shift from vertical to horizontal thinking and really orienting on how does the Treasury side of the equation connect to operations. How do you make that linkage? So we've been working with clients in putting in place a framework that does this, a framework that integrates or looks to integrate operations, capital, liabilities, and invested assets under a single analytical umbrella. The framework that we think makes sense has really 4 defining characteristics. The first is it's built on a single, unified, and comprehensive point-in-time catalog of risk across operations, capital, and liabilities. The second characteristic is that it maps risk offsets from commercial, managerial, or other or certain financial sources. The third is that it uses ultimately uses risk-based asset allocation to gauge net risk, and also to identify or help identify the potential cost of risk mitigation. And then the fourth is it becomes part of the ongoing decision review process of the organization, and that it ties, so the process that Charles described in getting to a financial plan that can give you the roadmap for tracking and thinking about financial health always feeds into this same process. So if you're updating that financial plan and updating that sense of financial health on an annual basis, you feed straight from that into updating your risk thinking also on an annual basis. So I'm going to go into each of those four characteristics in a little bit more detail over the next few slides. So really, probably one of the most important, if not the most important step in the process is building a catalog of potential claims on cash or risks that source from operations, capital, and liabilities. So the first thing to do is to identify and quantify those risks over some defined measurement period. And our financial plans might run over a 5-year horizon, but we may think about the risk piece of that over anywhere from 12 months to 3 years, and that becomes a discussion point. But we think that that process of identifying and quantifying risk, it should take into consideration both core business activities as well as strategic initiatives. It should build off that baseline, long-range financial and capital plan that Charles talked about. It should build off of your idea about what constitutes financial health from your organization. And then it can be expansive, but the universe of risks that you assess and start to identify and track has to be realistic. I mean, you can't be so small or so large that what you wind up with is almost a meaningless exercise, just because it's not the risks you're looking at aren't appropriately sized. So the first part, again, is this determination or the identification and quantification of risks. The second consideration is determining whether a particular risk can be hedged through external or commercial resources. So certain types of liabilities, floating rate debt liabilities as an example, can be, some elements of the risk can be hedged through commercial banks, letters of credit or other kind of liquidity facilities. So that's an example, but searching to see whether a risk can be hedged. The next consideration is whether a risk can be managed. And if it can, what does that mean over the measurement period? Does a management intervention or response to a risk generate a full or just a partial offset to risk? That becomes, the process of identifying and quantifying the risks, but then equally important, this process of thinking about can a risk be managed, pulls the operating side of the equation into the discussion in a very robust way. So you're really talking with people who are on the operating side or running the different line businesses within the enterprise that you're measuring about where you're getting their input on both where does risk come from and then how do they think they might managerially respond to risk. So so that's a real value point in this. Another consideration on the management question is other offsets that might be available. So Charles mentioned debt capacity as one of the elements of thinking about financial health. Well, the question in a risk situation is debt capacity available? Is it actually a risk offset? Is it something you can pull into the risk equation, or is it just not a particularly reliable resource? So again, what you're trying to understand is if you've identified a set of potential claims or risks, which might include capital, does that capacity help to offset that or not? So you sort of walk through, again, the process of identifying risks. Can it be hedged? Can it be managed? The result is some residual pool of risk that can't be hedged, can't be managed, and then there's a decision about what do you do with that. And basically the choices from our perspective are you either walk around with that risk, you carry it as unhedged, or your organization, and your balance sheet effectively becomes the hedge of last resort. Now, it's and then the related question is, if you are going to hedge that particular risk, how much are you going to hedge it? Are you going to hedge it 100%, or are you going to hedge some percentage of the risk? And there can be a lot of variation along that spectrum. But what you come out of this step with at the end of the chain is a single enterprise-wide risk map. And that risk map defines the risks that your organization has identified, adjusted for what you think you can hedge, what you think you can manage, and then an affirmative decision about how much of that particular pool or each particular risk you're going to hedge. It brings you to a single identified risk map, and that risk map is going to change over time. It's going to change every year as both your operating environment changes, but also as some of the future claims and things you're going to need to do to invest in the business changes as well. So it's the first sort of gateway into the risk analysis is this idea of a risk map. Slide 18 sort of gives you the schematic on it. Won't beat on it anymore, but again, it just runs you through this process of identify the base risk, get through a process of consideration, get to a net risk and a decision about how much to hedge through your balance sheet, and that gets you to this final risk map, which is the first real major checkpoint in the process. So then the next part is defining what the available risk resources are. And it's an equally important conversation. So the first conversation is what are the risks. The second conversation is what are the tools you have to deploy against those risks. So as noted, hedges and management offsets are already discussed under that risk mapping piece. The second is debt capacity, and that's also sort of discussed under the risk mapping piece or covered under there. The main piece that's left is really is the cash and investments. So the cash and investments across the organization, and the important discussion there, particularly within the higher education universe, is how those cash and investments might actually work in an enterprise risk analysis. So questions to think about are, what are the resources that are actually available to respond to realized risk versus what's set aside and effectively not available other than to support operations through some kind of, annual transfer of, whether it's through an endowment spending policy or what. The related subconnection really at the heart of it is what's the endowment's relationship to operations? Is it available to support operations through annual transfers, or is it actually available to help respond to realized operating risk or changes in performance? So in a corporate risk analysis, we would advocate for at least two views on this question. The first would be, to the extent that there are limitations on the ability to use endowment resources for certain events or to respond to certain events, that you certainly take that restricted or limited availability snapshot and you understand what that is. But then the second is to actually knock down all the barriers and just assume that all of the available balance sheet resources, including endowment, are available to be deployed just to really support operations and to support the total enterprise risk hedging process. It gives you, and you'll talk about this as we go through, it gives you a little bit different snapshot, which is helpful for framing the net risk position. So on slide 20, what you come out with is through this process, you start to get towards a framework that integrates operations and balance sheets. So the first step, you've got that risk assessment process that identifies the pools of risk that you're going to actually need to hedge through your balance sheet. And those risks have some defining characteristics. There's things like certainty, of the risk occurring, the timing of it, what it might look like if it does show up. All of those things mean, from our standpoint, that you can organize those risks into some different pools. We call them tiers, and those tiers have some common resources, again, mostly around the certainty of their occurrence and the potential timing of their occurrence. Then the second piece of that equation is you start to pull in those available investment resources to offset those pools of risk. And the way that we do that is to build, potentially hypothetical, but dedicated investment portfolios that are actually structured and married up to each of those particular tiers. Those pools are only built from the available resources, and that's, again, what makes that discussion about available cash so important to this particular analysis. But each of those pools is also going to have certain just portfolio characteristics in terms of volatility and what kind of asset classes might go in there. You build through those tiered risk pools, and at the end of that process, you wind up with something that we've referred to on this slide as Tier 4 or surplus funds. And that's the pool of residual investment resources that are free to pursue return, subject to any investment policy or other sort of natural constraints that you've placed on the investment portfolio. So what you're really doing, that pool is again, you've addressed all of the different risks across the organization. You've matched up a series of hedging resources, either external or internal, against those risks, and then you've left yourself with a residual pool that can pursue return. When you roll all those up, on slide 21, you can see what risk-based asset allocation gets you. And this is an example of from a particular client, and I'll just talk a little bit about the first sort of two columns on here. The existing column has a portfolio volatility of 12% and an implied days cash. This was a healthcare client of about 194 days. That means they had essentially 194 days of cash matched up against operating expenses, is what that metric tells you. But that was their implied cash floor, given that 12% portfolio volatility. And what you can see is their asset allocation on there and an expected return off of that portfolio of about 7.36%. What the tiered liquidity analysis or the tiered risk analysis suggested was that their target portfolio volatility should actually only be about 10.7%, and their expected return would be about 6.9%. So what this suggested was that the client was, quote unquote, over-risked. Theoretically, they were carrying more risk across operations and capital than their investment portfolio, the way it was naturally constructed, the way it was constructed in its silo following purely investment-centric decision-making, really should have supported. A different way of thinking about it was if they moved to a hedging model where they were using their investment portfolio to hedge risk first and then pursue return, there would have been about a 45 basis point cost or 45 basis point adjustment in their expected return. And that sort of intuitively makes some sense in the notion that, anytime you hedge risk, every hedge costs money. And what this is suggesting is that as you hedge risk, there's going to be a cost to it. So it makes some level of sense. But that's what you get to, is this idea of risk-based asset allocation, and then you can see how, at least in this particular situation, some of the different asset class allocations changed in that particular construct. What we wanted to do in the next couple of slides, 22 through 24, is just talk about a case study, which was a regional hospital system. Now, this was a little bit different because this organization very much wanted to link their investment decision-making to operations, capital, and liability realities. So in this instance, they were looking for the risk-based asset allocation process to become the driver in setting their actual asset allocation. Now, we're not necessarily, believers that that's the right way to use this. We certainly have a bunch of clients who do use it that way, but we have a bunch of other clients, and probably the majority, that use this particular work as one indicator, just one gauge to help them understand where their net organizational risk position is. But this was a client that was interested in actively using it for setting actual asset allocation. So they followed the whole process to build that out. And in this client's situation, we identified that they were under risk, that they could actually be significantly more aggressive across their investment portfolio. So different than the situation that was described on slide 21, where the client was over risk, they were actually under risk. Now they could take that risk or take on additional risk in a lot of different ways. They could either change their investment portfolio and increase their exposure to some riskier asset classes, or quite frankly, they could take more risk across operations. They actually used this to then go back and think about the acquisition of a physician group in their market, and that was how they were thinking about deploying some of their risk capacity, because the analysis suggested that they had more risk capacity than they had actually used. So on slide 23, this just gives, sort of a summary, a quick indication of some of the steps that we went through. It's really steps 1 and 2 of the process. So the first step, again, is developing that corporate risk map. And what we were doing here was looking at some scheduled and then contingent risks. And the contingent risks were really changes in some of their operating growth drivers. So in this case, it was inpatient and outpatient growth. Could be tuition activity, could be any number of different things. And then the second step is that process of establishing liquidity tiers. So it's really taking all of the different risks that are analyzed and organizing those into tiers that have certain liquidity characteristics. And in this case, it was the contingent pool, tier 3, that's shown on this slide, which are risks that might show up over a measurement period. So they're sort of out there in a contingent or a potential bucket. Slide 24 gives you a summary of again, this process that we followed with this organization, and what you get on step 4 is the initial risk-based asset allocation. So again, it's that similar to slide 21. In this client situation, it was what the total portfolio would look like in terms of volatility, tolerance, and then expected return. So it was the roll up to that initial static risk-based asset allocation, and then what those particular asset pools were. So on slide 25, what we see this framework as is as I mentioned, a lot of clients have used it to actually set asset allocation. We view it at a minimum as a really core decision support tool. We think there are a couple of particularly powerful elements to the framework. The first is it offers an opportunity to drive a common and really enterprise-wide discussion around the identification, the assessment, and then the measurement of risk. And then similar to that, it offers the same kind of common enterprise-wide discussion about offsets to risk, either from internal or external sources. And I would say that our experience in those 1 and 2 is, though even though this process might come out of finance and treasury, in most of our clients, ultimately it pulls in the operators, and it absolutely increases the operating side understanding of the treasury equation and of how their operating decisions and performance ripple across the financial position and the risk position of the organization. And then the third and most important element is it just provides a pretty differentiated perspective on how investment resources might be deployed. Because the principle of it and the goal of it is first, manage risk, and second, pursue return. So if you took that construct and that's what you deployed across your organization, this gives you a snapshot, gives you an opportunity to understand what that would mean and what it would mean for the organization. So it clarifies some of the as subcomponents, it can help clarify some of the potential liquidity and risk challenges of having balance sheet resources that aren't really available to support operations. So if you've got resources on the balance sheet that are significant but aren't really available to be deployed against risk management, this helps to frame that out for all of the different parts of the organization to understand. And then again, it helps to clarify how everything might look if balance sheet resources were more fully integrated into the operating and capital paradigm. So once that framework gets put into place, you can use it to assess some new risk initiatives. And this is where it gets interesting. So I made the reference before to the client that went through the process and determined that they were sort of under-risked. So then they had a choice, and they had the choice about how do they spend that risk capacity. And the question is where, for any organization that's in that position, it's the same question. What do you do? Do you either keep that in your pocket and use it for something down the road, or are there opportunities for you to take more risk in operations or opportunities to take more risk on your balance sheet? And what you can also do once the framework is put into place is to understand, well, if you're going to take risk in operations, or if you truly have a choice around there, you can do some testing around what's the best return for a particular unit of risk. Are you better off, taking more risk in a liability portfolio than in an investment portfolio, or are you better taking some additional risk in operations? It can help you look at those different types of indicators. So just in wrapping up, ultimately the whole discussion comes back to this corridor of control. And the question is, what's the appropriate risk corridor of control, and how is your organization positioned against that corridor? So the long-range financial plan and that financial health corridor is really the start of it all. It sets the foundation for truly getting to a truly horizontal understanding of operating and capital perspective or expectations. And from that foundation, you can go into a very powerful framework for thinking about your risk corridor of control and how balance sheet, once connected to that operating and capital paradigm, how that might work, how it might look differently, and what does that actually mean for the organization. And given that the operating environment for the higher education industry is changing, as Charles said, given that there's a lot of different elements going on, we think that this particular approach can be very helpful, provide a really good decision support tool for understanding and testing balance sheet resources against risk. So thanks very much, and we're happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Eric and Charles, for sharing your insights with the audience. We have a couple of questions that have come through already. As a reminder to the audience, you're welcome to submit your questions to us through the attendee interface on your computer. Just type in the question, hit submit, and we'll monitor them as they come through, and happy to entertain them. One question we have wanted to address is, outlined a very comprehensive framework for tackling the issue of risk. Coming back to the starting point, though, what are your recommendations? What are the practicalities of getting started with going down this path of managing risk?
Well, there's a couple of different ways to go at it. So we've had clients. We're believers, as I mentioned in my remarks, that building a risk map and a detailed risk map is just a really valuable exercise. And the deeper you can go on that, the better. Now that does require that you're going to be doing some level of financial and capital planning, and that there's going to be a good dialogue across the organization that pulls those different components of operations and capital into the discussion. We think that makes an enormous amount of sense, and that it's the right place to start. That said, we have had clients that have chosen to at least up front in the initials, in the first cut of things, sort of shortcut the operating side and make some higher level assumptions. We had actually one client that really was looking at operating risks just by taking percentages of expenses as an example, and using that sort of shortcutted process to go into the tiered liquidity analysis. So they did a shortcut version on operations, a pretty deeper dive on capital, a deeper dive on liabilities. Their interest was in getting to the risk-based asset allocation, which they did that first cut, and then over time they've sort of gone back, and every year they go a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper and then a little bit deeper into the operating side of the equation. So they chose to sort of get the framework in place and to get their governance comfortable with that framework, and then to start going deeper into the assumptions that build into the creation of the risk map. So you can go at it in different ways. It's really what would be most helpful to each organization at a particular point in time.
Great, thank you. You outlined the example where asset allocation was the motivation for going down this path. Have you seen other motivations, particular motivations for organizations pursuing this issue of risk management across their enterprise?
Well, I mean, again, our point of view is that the risk-based asset allocation gives you the gauge for testing that risk. It's a great way of testing that particular thing. There are a lot of ancillary benefits that come out of this. So, my perspective is as a supplement. I think that the discussion Charles is having on financial health is absolutely critical, and getting a really clear definition about financial health is just an imperative for any organization. But what you can build off of that, even if you just go to a risk map as an example and stop there, you can get tremendous value from that, and the value comes from under one single analytical framework and umbrella, you can have an enterprise-wide conversation about risk. So you can pull in lots of different pieces of the organization, and you can build a better understanding across the organization about what risks do you think you all are carrying, and then equally important, how would you respond to those risks? Are they, and what does that mean in terms of back end if things start to go in a more negative direction? So I think there are pieces of it along the way that can provide tremendous value, and that clients have really found great value in just some of the components.
Great, thank you again. Those are the questions we've received here today. So with that, I want to thank our audience for their participation. We hope you found the presentation insightful. If you have additional questions as you contemplate the subject of financial health and risk, Charles and Eric welcome you reaching out to them directly at their email address. So you're welcome to visit kaufmanhall.com/highereducation to learn more about the work we're doing in this arena as well. Again, thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you again soon.